Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Digest. Today, I'm really looking forward to this interview. I've known this guy for a long, long time. He's very close to me. He's Lieutenant Commander Gary Steiger, who was an officer in the Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy, and he's now the founder of VESPA. Hi, Gary. Welcome to the Digest. Can you explain to us what VESPA is?
Yeah, sure. It's basically it's an acronym for the Veterans and Emergency Services Parabiathlon Australia, and I organised it as a wellbeing vehicle for ex-defence people, with or without with mental and physical injuries, basically, to give them an opportunity to take part in the sport of biathlon, which is Nordic skiing, so cross-country skiing and shooting. Being in Australia, in Adelaide at the moment, at home in Adelaide, there's not a lot of snow down here, so we tend to the training is going to be, because we're still in a fledgling situation. The training is going to be on roller skis and with laser rifles, but then we'll progress on to the slopes and use proper skis and laser and or 22 rifles.
Okay, pretty interesting. I know that you're into your shooting because you're ex-forces. So can you give us a general lowdown of what your job was while you were in the military?
Yeah, sure. In my job, unlike most military people, actually, we don't have a lot of exposure to firearms, which is it's a little bit of a surprise to a lot of people outside of the military. Even the infantrymen generally don't use and train on firearms daily. But my job was, when I first joined, I was in submarine communications. So I worked on nuclear missile submarines in the 80s, deploying on patrol for up to 12 weeks at a time. And I left the Navy in 89, rejoined in 98, and changed trades to medic. So I became a medic. I spent the best part of 10 years as a maritime combat medic, and then specialised in operating theatres. So I was an operating department practitioner. And then I commissioned, so I became an officer. So I joined up as a normal sailor, and then I became an officer in late 2010 as a medical administrator. I left the Royal Navy in 2014 and transferred to the Australian Navy, where I've been ever since. I got promoted to Lieutenant Commander in 2019. Late 18, I beg your pardon. And then I left recently, transferred to a reserve service category. So I'm doing a few weeks reserve time and dipping in and out of that as the projects come up. So I'm now basically a project officer in the reserves. I'm doing a lot of volunteering and also trying to build the VESPA thing in the not-for-profit space.
All right. Now you mentioned you started as a naval seaman, I think they're called, and you changed branches from comms to medicine. That's quite a change. So what kind of training did you have to undergo as a medic?
The background for the change came because radio operators were pure radio operators. That was their only job. And when I came back in the Navy after an 8-year break in service, they become operating mechanics, which also involved proper sailor work, like deck work with ropes and chains and what have you. And while it sounds great, actually, I didn't fancy getting up at 2 a.m. to jump on a buoy and fall in the sea probably. So you know how clumsy I am. So I retraded to medic, and it basically took the training to be a maritime medical assistant, as they were called, is around 14 months. So we trained to the same standard as paramedics with regards to trauma and life support, but there's a lot more about administration. Most of the medical assistant's job is about administration. Seeing patients is only about 5% of our job. It's all about health promotion and health administration in the main. And then if there's a exercise or an emergency on board, or we do disaster relief, things like that, or indeed a war, then we're about medical organisation for action, and getting guys back into the fighting is our first priority in that condition. So if someone, for example, has got a broken arm that needs setting, but they can go back to work, and there's someone who's sort of in danger of bleeding out, then you might have to do what they call a bit of reverse triage, which is basically get the guy back fighting before you treat the guy who's could likely die. It's an interesting dilemma if you ever get it, and thankfully I never had to. It's very, very rare, but it does happen.
Wow. All right. Yeah. Bizarre. It's a strange one to think about that.
It is. It is.
You mentioned deploying there when you introduced yourself. How many times did you deploy operationally in your career?
4 times. 3 times on submarines, and once with the civil and military cooperation group, the military stabilisation support group. I also did the odd bit of stints. We would sail on a deployment which wasn't operational, but we'd have spells of operational a week or 2 here or there, doing things like counter drugs, counter gun running, things like that, in places like Caribbean, Southeast Asia.
Right, and what about the deterrent patrols that you did?
Yeah, that was basically, I never knew where we were, but there was a very good chance we were North Atlantic, possibly Barents Sea, anywhere where we could lob a Polaris missile onto the Soviet Union, as they were then, basically. Right,
and you also you were in Afghanistan for a while. How was that?
That was amazing. And my role there was the medical liaison officer to the provincial reconstruction team. So these are the most incredible individuals. They're basically civilians, lots of them with no military experience whatsoever, unarmed, and they basically go out to all these hotspots and trouble spots and disease areas, and to basically stand up or reinstitute a medical or social economic development system in a country that's been ravaged by war, by disease, or by natural disasters. And I learned so much from those guys and girls about humility, mainly girls, I must admit, as well. They're quite humbling. It's quite a humbling experience working with those people. I would go out into places like Mustakala, Sangin in Helmand province, which was the most kinetic province in Afghanistan. And I would be out there armed, and they would be going out, under escort, but no means of defending themselves whatsoever, no training to defend themselves. They were absolutely in our and the security details care, basically. So that was an incredible experience for me. It's scary at times. We came under fire a few times. Lost one of our guys out there, but it was the most satisfying job that I'd done in Navy, because it was just so worthwhile. We were rebuilding the health system in Afghanistan. I played a very small part in it. I was a liaison between the civilians in the social economic development team, the stabilisation group, who were my unit, the combat call signs, so the battle group commanders and their people, and the Afghan Ministry of Public Health. So it was just incredible. It was I was based in a place called Lashkar, which the guys in the patrol base is called Las Vegas, because it was pretty comfortable. But I would fly out via helicopter or drive out to patrol bases, and then patrol out on foot or in a vehicle to look at the health facilities that the Afghan government had put in place. And basically make sure that they were, for example, employing all the people they said they were employing. So they had generally nurses there, and they were getting employed, and they weren't just redirecting the money elsewhere. Fantastic job.
Yeah. That's quite a difference from life being on a submarine. So how was the transfer for that? If you spend so much time sort of in a sardine tin underwater, and then all of a sudden you're on the ground. What are the differences there?
Yeah, a lot more sunlight for a start. Absolutely. I didn't come home with vitamin D deficiency. Yeah, but I was amazed to find in my tent in Lashkar another submariner who was a military interpreter. So out of 5 or 6 people in the tent, 2 of us were submariners, which is a lot of people will be surprised at. Wow. But what you have to remember with the British Armed Forces is the Royal Marines, the amphibious elite infantry. But they're part of the Royal Navy. They're actually Royal Navy Corps. And wherever they deploy, they will have support staff who are either commando trained or not commando trained, Army and Navy. So you'll basically have guys wearing the naval blue beret like me, but deploying with them on the ground to these places, patrolling out with them, particularly medics, engineers, clerks. Particularly those guys deploy a lot on the ground. So while they join the dark blue and expect a life on the ocean wave, they actually end up somewhere like Iraq or Afghanistan, in the middle of the desert. It's very, very regular occurrence. It's every deployment. We'll see a lot of Navy people in land department.
Right. Okay. So, you yourself, are you better on the ground or at sea?
On the ground, thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. Look, I joined the Australian Navy, and one of my jobs out here has been to do policy and governance, and that included auditing the sick bays on board submarines. And I flew out to the west of Australia to do my first audit on a Collins class boat. It's a diesel electric submarine, very capable bit of kit. But when I got on board, I was just so excited. It was like, oh, I feel like I'm back home. You know, this is where I come from. You know. And I went down to the mess spaces and saw just how tight they are again. And I was thinking, after about an hour, I'm like, do you know what? No, so I won't say it's a young man's game, but we're incredibly adaptable as human beings. And the younger we are, the more adaptable we are, I think. And I was 19, 20 when I was going to sea on submarines. I was going back as a 50-something-year-old, early 50s. And it's like, as they say in Australia. Give me the land deployments, give me tentage anytime these days. I did a couple of 6-month deployments on a assault ship. So that was pretty big, 20,000 tons, didn't move a lot in the sea. But yeah, I just, I don't know, I just didn't feel as at home there as I did under canvas. I think that was it became much more my thing in the later part of my career.
Yeah. Having left the forces, I've spoken to a number of people recently about mental health issues. I'm writing a book on it as we speak, actually. So
good work.
Yeah. What's the? There's an awful lot of press about this. Did you have any mental health issues after or while you were deployed, even?
No. Besides being bloody terrified when the helicopter suddenly drops and to evade incoming, or you have an explosion out the back of a V-22 Osprey that you're being driven around in. But I didn't sort of take place in actual combat. I came under fire, but I never fired my weapon back. And that apparently is a bit of a thing with that. That is an important point in mental health of people who deploy into war zones, where they get to fire their rifle or not, for different reasons as well. But I actually was made as a military man, I was completed by my tour to Afghanistan. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had a good tour. I performed well. If I hadn't performed well, though, it would have been damaging, no doubt about it. If I felt my action or inaction had harmed somebody, that would be incredibly difficult to take. But I actually did suffer from a mental health breakdown, but it was long after Afghanistan. It took me about 3 months to get back to normal from Afghanistan, because I was completely, hyper vigilant when I got back. But that continued right through to come back to Australia. So I probably only stopped that a couple of years ago. Just as I'm walking down the street, knowing in my regular route to work where all the angled windows were that I could in the shops that I could check mile 6 sort of thing, and that sort of thing. And that went on for a long time, because when you deploy for 6 months, you don't really realize it, but you're completely, totally aware all the time that at any moment, no matter how safe you think the bases you're on, it could all change. And suddenly it gets very, difficult. So it takes a long time to come down from that, and sort of mentally and physically. But then over time, little things will creep back into your mind, and not in a bad way for me. A lot of guys get, problems with recurring dreams and terrors and things like that, because they suffered a lot more than I did. They were in actual combat, like I wasn't, and probably had, sort of mortar rounds and Chinese rockets exploding around them. And again, their actions or inactions might then make them think about what they did and cause them problems. But my actual issues came about because of a very benign situation militarily, but it was basically all about a poor manager in a stressful job basically ending up in the breakdown of my marriage, and a pretty big reversal in that regard, which ended up with me completely losing executive function, which is an incredibly scary thing. You know, I went from being a highly competent and confident guy who's just done everything that I would ever have wanted to do in the military to suddenly being this guy who can't follow basic signage at an airport. And it was, you know, it was heartbreaking for me. It was at one point, it was, you know, really a struggle to understand if I'd ever really truly come back from it. Because it takes so bloody long to do. And it's not just necessarily the combat. There's a thing they talk about, the bucket. You've only got so much that you can take in your bucket before it starts overflowing, and that was a classic thing, I think, with me, that it was I'd had such good experiences on submarines in the Navy generally, and deployed on the ground, but suddenly when something just comes in and things overflow, it goes wrong pretty quickly. And I thought I understood mental health, being a medic, and I was a senior sailor for quite some time, for 7 years, so a senior medic for 7 odd years. Then I commissioned, and I thought I knew all about, you know, mental health, but I actually didn't. I realised that I didn't understand it at all until I actually suffered from a breakdown, and then I understood how people can just go from being this super confident person and competent person to just being pretty hopeless, actually. And it's a very unpleasant experience.
Yeah, you mentioned there that it was it's a non-military thing that caused that, a chaotic commanding officer. Now that I don't know if you're aware of the Peter principle, but Professor Peter, he wrote a research paper and said that essentially people get promoted to their up to their level of incompetence, and they tend to stay there. And so that you know, they can't move on any further because they're incompetent to do anything else, or they're crap at that job, but they still stay in those positions. So how does the Navy deal with that kind of stuff? Because you would think that you would need people performing at the top of their game in those positions, especially when, you know, we're talking military.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to attack anybody on this, because they're not here to defend themselves. Excuse the cat. And secondly, you know, there are other people who work with that individual who rate them. You know, I just have my own views, particularly on just the way they go about their business, that just made things so much harder than they needed to be. And then they were very much about covering their own arse when things were difficult. Whereas I was more about trying to get things resourced properly by being honest about everything. And we just had a clash of ideals. So it's really as simple as that. But the problem with things like the Navy and the public service, if you're not the senior person in a scrap, is that you're going to lose. You know, if there's some stoosh between a lieutenant commander and a commander, the lieutenant commander is going to lose every time. You know. And yes, there are people who I would absolutely say are incompetent in every walk of life. But the problem with anything in public service is that it's an incredibly difficult place to actually do anything about people who won't change their ways, despite, you know, whether that's through performance management or rebriefing or whatever. And I think that's the same across the world, really. I don't think that's anything peculiar to Australia.
You mentioned your marriage breakdown there. How did your ex-wife deal with you being in, if we can sort of skip back to Afghanistan for a while, the most dangerous province in the most dangerous country in the world? How did she cope with that?
Horribly, to be honest with her. You know, she did the very best she could, but she had we had a very poor start in that I flew into Afghanistan and did a week where you do zeroing your rifle and counter improvised explosive device drills, and then you deploy out to your patrol base or main operating base. And the 2 days after we got to our main operating base, 2 people were killed on our base. And when it came under fire from the Afghan army, of all people, actually. And the guy who did that was killed in the response, but there were he took 2 guys with him. And it came over the news when I'd told her from the off that she'd hear nothing bad by phone. It would be a visit in person. But she was driving 5 hours to see her mum. And it came over the news that 2 people had been killed in Lashkar Gah. and relatives were yet to be informed. And I had a line through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office because the military communication goes down as soon as there's an incident. It goes down. But I knew that it'd be reported as the relatives yet to be informed. So I got on the FCO phone and phoned her mobile and just he went to answer phone. I just said, I'm okay. And that was it, hung up. What I didn't realise was that call, because it was going to my next of kin, it was being routed through my rear party. So on her mobile phone, it showed MSSG calling. And she'd just heard on the radio 2 people had been killed in my base. So she was then had to pull over the next service station because she didn't have hands free, and which was a few miles down the road. And she said it was the longest drive of her life, those few miles, to find out that it was me saying I'm okay. And from that moment on, she struggled badly. It was a case of our apartment that we lived in was a garden flat on one side, a basement on the other. So if anyone rang the doorbell, she had to go a flight of stairs blind and open the door and couldn't see through any windows or anything like that. And every time that doorbell rang, then she was expecting to see a padre and a man in navy uniform with some bad news. So it was just hellish for her, far worse for me. I knew when I was generally going out and walking into danger or driving into danger, and I knew when it was a more benign area and I was pretty much going to be okay, no matter what really happened. But she didn't. So the whole 6 months plus, it was about just short of 7 months I was there. She was just on tenterhooks all the time, and every time the doorbell rang, she was just in bits. So not easy, really not easy.
Yeah. And that's an aspect that people don't really think about, isn't it? The effect that that military life has on the family. Certainly, when you're deployed into a dangerous area.
Oh, massively. I used to have army mates that I was close to, because in operating theatres we worked very tri-service, and they always said, "Oh, it's much harder for my other half than me." And I used to think, "How is that? How can that be?" But then I understood it when that happened, and I think that's what isn't understood then, when the spouses have so little input, well, they have no input at all to your career. They just aren't allowed to get involved whatsoever, because if they do, it'll ruin your career. And my issue that I had was that I was going through my chain of command and dealing with the issue that I had. But my ex just wanted me to go straight to the admiral, because she'd heard of people doing that and getting what they wanted. But that's that's a very rare opportunity. And if I'd done that, it would have ruined my credibility with the Australian Navy. So there was no way I was going to do it. So I basically had to tell her to butt out. And she felt that she'd been thrown under the bus because when it came to the complaint that I eventually put in anyway, it just got yeah, cheers for that. No, it's nothing to see here. And that's when she up sticks and went, because she'd had enough, basically.
Right.
There's more to it than that. I can't just blame the Navy, that individual in the Navy for that, but that was the root cause of it. Right. And then it spiraled out from there. Once she went back to her home nation, it was because she was not English by birth. Yeah. It all just went tits up from there, basically.
Gary, expanding on the issue of mental health with ex-servicemen, I've spoken to a couple of military people recently, as I mentioned at the start of our conversation, about about how difficult they find it to fit back into society once they've left the armed forces. And there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of help out there for guys. You mentioned that you were okay coming out of there. It was different things that affected you. How going forward? And we hear an awful lot in the press as well about mental issues of our ex-servicemen. Lots of them end up being homeless and unable to hold down a job. And I've recently interviewed someone who killed himself, the partner of someone who killed himself after he finished his second tour of Afghanistan. He'd done Croatia and Bosnia and a number of other things, Northern Ireland, seen people killed and mass graves of children and rape victims and all sorts of horrible stuff, and they're not equipped to deal with that kind of thing. So how does one of these guys fit into civilian life once they come out?
Well, there actually is a lot that the military, Royal Navy and Australian Navy or Australian Defence Force, I've actually got a pretty good handle on this now. They give you a really good package and of benefits for leaving, retraining, what have you. I think a lot of the problem is it's pretty subjective on where your last posting is. Because if you're posted to an operational unit, say one of the warships, and it's deploying, you may get a very, very short time, if any at all, between you being landed from that ship and then leaving the Navy. So you don't get the time always to take advantage of all of the benefits that you get. For example, you can get 20 days leave from the Australian Navy to get experience or do administration for transiting out of the military, which is pretty good, you know. But if you're flying back to Australia a week before you leave, you haven't got the opportunity to do that. I think also with a lot of people who struggle with mental health who are serving, they have the opportunities there. But look, when I love Are You OK Day, and I love what everyone's doing about mental health, because I didn't realise it was such a big problem. When I left in the UK and came to Australia, I was thinking, oh my God, you know, Australia's got this big problem the UK haven't got. What is it out here? Is there something in the water? What I didn't realise was that actually Australia was streets ahead of the UK in identification and research into mental health, and they just had a better attitude towards it. There's still work to do, there's no doubt about it, but they just had a better attitude in the UK. But the UK is starting to catch up now. But when you're struggling with something, someone saying, are you okay? Are you okay? When I was in my depths of my issues, which weren't, you know, significant when you compare to a lot of people, they were significant to me because everything's relative, you know, but a lot of people suffer a lot more than I did. And that's actually a thing you'll hear. Someone else needs it more than me. They won't get referred onto programs because the people in far worse shape than me who really need it. And that's something we really have to grip up and say, no, actually, you're worth it. And the earlier you get intervention, the better. But you don't want to talk to people, you know, when you're struggling like that. And I had a real spiral of descent of going into a pretty dark place. And I just, I didn't want to break. I just felt no inclination to break that. I just didn't trust anybody in the military anymore. I didn't want to socialize with anybody for my other own reasons. And I just wanted to shut the doors. And I lived in Bondi Junction overlooking the Tasman, and I wouldn't leave my apartment, you know, other than go to work. It was ridiculous, but I didn't want to do anything else, you know. So it's about, you have to engage these things. And it's having the will to engage it and the reason to engage it, I guess, or even the time in some people's case. So there is a lot out there, but it's about the ability to engage it and the will to engage it. And what you also have to remember as well, I'm doing some voluntary work now. I did a couple of courses recently called Mind Right and Story Right that are done by the Military Emergency Services Health Australia. And my partner's actually the executive director, and I'm not just saying it's because it's her unit, but they're great courses because they really look at your mindset and translate it into the civil sector and what you can offer those people. But first of all, they actually help you find out exactly who you are, which sounds pretty strange, but I honestly didn't understand myself fully until I was around 55. And I was trying to be something I thought I should be or whatever, you know, for a lot of my life. And you know, from the various stages of what people think of themselves and how indoctrinated they are, if you like, or institutionalized they are in the military. It's about making them not forget the great things the military has taught them, because they teach us so much about independence and looking after ourselves and not being a burden. But it becomes too much. You know, we become very unselfish because we're all about duty. Well, I joined the Navy to do a duty to the nation, and I always felt that we have a military to deal with things so that civilians don't have to think about them. But nowadays with communication, they're much more involved in it. So when something goes wrong, and the way media is, they make the most of it and try and sensationalize it and that. But what you got to remember is my partner was the main author of a couple of longitudinal studies into military mental health in Australia, and they came up with a whole load of findings regarding early intervention and predictions, mental health predictors before people have an issue. Like, you can actually almost identify it if you're asking the right questions before it happens. But what you have to remember is a lot of people join the military, and her research has shown this, they join with issues. The ADF doesn't. Everyone who leaves the ADF with a mental health issue hasn't necessarily been broken by the ADF. They may, or by the experiences in the ADF, I should say. They may well have been, but there's every chance they haven't, because there's a lot of people join the military to escape things. So they actually join on that upward trajectory, if you like. And if you're doing like a K10 or a DAS score, and you're scoring below the cutoff where a healthcare professional would recommend you get assistance and counselling, you could take 2 or 3 of those and remain below the cutoff, but your results could be climbing. And those are the people who really need that to be identified and get that early intervention. And that's what people like Mesha, Phoenix Australia are trying to do, and get that research done to get the various points of it in time. They've got 2010 data, they've got 2015 data, I think it is, and there's no other nation in the world that's got the data that Australia's got. But to get 3 points would be absolutely holy grail, and you can really get some great predictive information from these things. So there's a lot of fantastic work going on. A lot of it, sponsored by Defence, and cats are great, aren't they? A lot of it is sponsored by Defence. So to say there's nothing out there is inaccurate, and I think that a lot of the media are very keen to portray that, but sometimes it's about situations and circumstances.
Yeah, thanks for dispelling that often quoted myth. Now again, having another part of integrating back into society is when our forces come back with fewer limbs than they went with, and that's something that you're working with. So can you expand a little bit more on that as well?
Yeah, sure. Just as a footnote to what I said, by the way, and all views here are my own, by the way, as well, nobody else's. But I can only talk about the here and now and me and what's happening now. There are people from the past, it was different. The Vietnam era, things like that, and since then, even until pretty recently, things were different. So it's a lot better now than it was. So for any of you guys who might have left 5 or 10 years ago, calling me all sorts of names, I'm talking about what's happening now. But yeah, and what's happening now for me with the VESPA side is I wanted to take part in the sport of biathlon since I saw it on Eurosport in the 90s. These crazy Vikings flying around on snow in cross-country skis with a rifle on their back, frozen snotters down their chin, and then stopping and shooting these stupidly small targets and then skiing off again and thinking, that's insane, and I've got a bit of a history of beasting myself and pushing myself hard when I do PT, so it really appealed to me. And I did a lot of shooting as well. So I got in 2014, 15, I think it was, I saw a signal for the ADF Championship, so I applied, and the next year I went along, and it was such a perfect sport for, I thought, for ex-military people, particularly those who had left medically, possibly injured, with a loss of a limb or something like that. And that's where I sort of focused initially on people who'd lost limbs. And I was looking at whether we could do this as a voluntary thing where we bring veterans to the snow to try out the sport. And I chatted to Miranda Van Hoof, Associate Professor Miranda Van Hoof now, who is my partner before we were partners, saying about this, this great sport. And she said, well, it sounds perfect, because a lot of the guys who leave medically miss the military lifestyle. And biathlon is a military originated sport. And they miss the camaraderie of that. And they also miss the opportunity of mastery, because they've lost their opportunity to do what they do for a living. And they may not have got into retraining something else. So biathlon is it seemed to be the perfect vehicle. So in 2019, I did a military-inspired assault course called True Grit down here, a 12-kilometre assault course. And I did it with a guy called Mark Daniels, who was serving Navy at the time, who lost a leg, above knee amputee. And I asked him if he fancied coming to the ADF Championships, if I could sort him out sponsorship. And he's like, yeah, absolutely, because he wants to try everything, Mark does. He's hugely in demand. The alpine ski, he went from my thing to the alpine skiing team. He did Ninja Warrior, and got further than a lot of people with 2 Mark 1 limbs, and he's there with his version 2 leg, and gets halfway down the course before he falls in the Oggen, you know, before he falls in the water. Incredible individual, such a strong mind and body. And I put him on the snow. And at 11 o'clock in the morning, he was getting a bit frustrated and a bit arsey. And I said, "Are you all right, mate?" And he's like, he said, "No, this is annoying." I said, "Well, why? You're out in the Mount Hotham, the beautiful, you know, alpine area of Australia. It's beautiful, you know, snow around. It's in the fresh air. What's the problem, mate?" And he's like, "Well, everything I've done before, within an hour or two, I'm all over it. I've mastered it." He said, "This is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life." And that was perfect for me. It's exactly what I wanted to hear. But I learned a lot from that. But like, he should have actually been sit skiing, not stand skiing. But Mark being Mark, he just thrashed his way up the hill just with his arms, you know, and got himself around this ridiculously technical course, and then shot well at the end of it. So while I was doing that, the Australian Biathlon Association were there, and I decided this is what I wanted to do this as a sideline. I wanted to get military people into doing biathlon because it's the perfect sport for them. And it's a great well-being sport as well. If you've got guys with mental health issues, you can use the laser rifles if there's a problem with carrying firearms and that sort of thing. But it's a perfect well-being vehicle for ex-defence people. And basically, the Australian Biathlon Association were on the mountain doing their Masters Championships at the same time as us. And they'd been trying since post-Sochi 2014 to create a biathlon Paralympic team, and had failed because they couldn't find the athletes with the grit to hack it, basically, who had lost a limb or whatever, and then could get themselves around the course. And they saw me escorting Mark around the course and putting him through his paces, and they're like that, bing, veterans are our people. So they asked me to basically use my contacts to build a Australian team with a view to competing in the 2026 Paralympics in Isolation, Italy. And I'm like, oh my God, yeah, absolutely, I'd love to do it. You know, big task, but I've learned a lot from the Mesha experience about collaboration and using expertise rather than trying to reinvent it. So I'm basically doing like I did in Afghanistan in the later stages of that operation, was all about signposting to the local government, to the local experts, and that's what I've been doing with Mesha. So I basically pull the athletes in and I'm sort of managing contacts. And I have the Invictus Pathways program down here in Adelaide, which is a fantastic program. They've offered me not only any athletes who want to have a look, but also their therapists, psychotherapists, their physiotherapists, occupational therapists, and the gym, etc., from athletes. I've got Veteran Sports Australia. We're doing some mutual marketing for each other with that, and Disabled Winter Sports Australia, who are the people who put all athletes through anyone going to the Paralympics has to go through Disabled Winter Sports Australia. So these guys are all my partners. I've got coaches who want to get involved all around the country as well. So it is fantastic, and they've all got their own things going on, and I'm basically just linking this all together, or trying to link it all together. Because a lot of people say that, I hear a lot down since I left the military about there's too many ex-service organisations. I disagree with that, but I think there's too much duplication. I think there's not enough communication and collaboration between the ESOs, possibly. I'm very new to the space, so I have my naiveties, but my partner's been around it for a very long time. But it's a really exciting space, and I think it's really good a really good takeaway for anyone looking at this and thinking about what helps out there for our military. It's not just a government responsibility and a defence responsibility. It's actually a social responsibility, and a lot of industry now have switched onto that, and they're really getting behind that. What do they call it? The corporate social responsibility, I think it is. And they're backing these things, and they're in their donations and their charity programs. They're looking at these things, and defence is very much in the forefront of that. Ex-defence people, less so emergency services, first responders, but certainly out here, and I think around the world now in the mental health research space for veterans, I think a lot of them, and certainly in Australia, they're in the emergency service space as well, because those guys, you compare the police to the ADF, for example. Now, without the police, we've got no society, but they get nothing. They get nothing. You can say about, oh my God, these soldiers, sailors, airmen come back and they get nothing. Well, actually they do. But see, the cops who go out every day and don't know what are they going to face from 1 hour to the next, they get nothing, you know. So I think that's a great thing that those two public service charities are starting to mesh together, and that the support is being spread between the Ambos Fireys and the I'm so Aussie these days. Ambos Fireys and the police and the Rozzers. There you go. Get my English back on.
Okay. On a final note, I looked on your LinkedIn company profile, and you're looking for someone to from the legal side that might help, not with fundraising, but sort of the business of fundraising. So, what areas are you looking for help for there?
Basically, I've just started investigating today because I'm looking for credit. I'm not looking for a freebie. But I can't fundraise yet, and I've like bought a pair of roller skis and poles, but that's about all I can afford at the moment to self-fund. But I can't put anyone in those roller skis until I have insurance. I can't get insurance until I can pay for it, so I can't pay for it until I get fundraising. I can't fundraise until I'm registered as a public beneficiary, public benevolent institution. Here in Australia. So I'm looking for someone who can do that for me on credit and help me with that, because like I said, I'm volunteering for 3 different things. I'm doing some reservist work, and I'm looking for probably part-time work that's paid as well to pay all the bills. So I'm looking for some credit, but a business lawyer who can help me out with that. So if any of you are Australian viewers might be able to do that, then I'll be really interested to hear from them. And I'll absolutely, I'm more than happy to pay my wages. I can't pay you right now.
Yeah. All right. Okay. It sounds really exciting, and obviously, I wish you all the luck in the world with it. And as I know you so well, I'm almost I'm sure that it will all work out in the end.
Look, I've got some great partners who will make it happen. They'll support me through it. They've got the experience behind. If I'm struggling with it, I've just got a lot of great people to ask advice, and my partner as well is just so in this space. She's a great advisor.
All right, that's fantastic, Gary. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you again, mate. Take care.
Always is, Andy. Thanks very much, mate.
Take care. You're welcome. Bye bye.